They moved without talking, which is what people do when they already know what they are going to find, and the only question is how much of it the mountain has decided to give back. It had been 3 days since the 7 men disappeared. 3 days of watching the slope. 3 days of radio calls that nobody answered. 3 days of the kind of waiting that expedition members who survive these situations describe afterward in interviews with a specific word. Not grief, not panic, but suspension. The sense of being held in a moment that has not yet officially become what it already is. Boyd Everett had built this team over years. He had selected each member specifically. He knew their climbing histories, their decision-making under pressure, their particular strengths on technical terrain at altitude. The American Dhaulagiri expedition of 1970 was not an ad hoc collection of enthusiasts. It was one of the strongest high-altitude teams the United States had assembled to that point in the history of Himalayan climbing. 6 of the 7 men who were on that slope on April 2nd were among the best alpinists in the country. The mountain took all of them in the same minute. What follows is what the search party actually found, what the evidence told the people who pieced it together afterward, and why the story of the 1970 Dhaulagiri expedition is one of the most important and least told chapters in the entire history of Himalayan mountaineering. This is not a story about mistakes. That is the first thing to understand before we go further. Subscribe if you're new here. Let's get into it. Dhaulagiri sits in the Myagdi district of western Nepal. 8,167 meters. Its name in Sanskrit means dazzling white, and from the plains of India, it appears as an impossibly large white mass suspended above the horizon. So large that for a period in the early 19th century, European surveyors, who had not yet penetrated the Himalayan interior to take accurate measurements, believed it might be the highest point on Earth. It is not, but it looks like it could be. What the surveys conducted from the plains could not convey, and what only becomes apparent when you are physically on the mountain or immediately beneath it, is the nature of its architecture. Dhaulagiri does not slope, it drops. Its south face falls nearly 4,000 meters from summit to valley floor in a descent so close to vertical that it constitutes one of the greatest continuous altitude differentials of any mountain on the planet. Its ridges are complex and unstable, permanently loaded with wind-deposited snow that accumulates on the high faces and periodically releases in avalanches that can reach the valley floor kilometers below. The mountain is also, critically, large enough to generate its own weather. Sitting between the Kali Gandaki Gorge to the east, the deepest river gorge on Earth, and the dry plateau of Upper Mustang to the north, Dhaulagiri stands at the intersection of air masses with radically different temperature and moisture profiles. The warm, wet air from the Indian subcontinent, moving north, meets the cold, dry air moving south off the Tibetan Plateau, and Dhaulagiri sits in the middle of this collision like a wall. The weather patterns this produces are not like the weather patterns on other Himalayan peaks. Storms form faster. They come from directions that contradict what the sky looked like an hour before. The specific topography of the mountain channels and accelerates wind in ways that experienced meteorologists who have studied Himalayan weather specifically describe as among the most difficult to forecast of any peak in the range. Early expeditions to Dhaulagiri found this out the hard way. The mountain confused people who had read weather correctly on other mountains for their entire careers. Hit the like button if this kind of context is what you came for. One click. The Everett expedition had been on Dhaulagiri since early March 1970. By April, they had established a series of camps in the northeast spur, a technically demanding line that climbs the mountain's northeast ridge and had not been completed before. The team was experienced enough that their progress had been methodical rather than aggressive. They had read the mountain carefully, retreated when conditions warranted, and built their position on the upper mountain with the patience that distinguishes expeditions that come home from those that don't. There is no evidence, from any account of the expedition or any subsequent analysis, that the team was taking risks that their experience and judgment should have led them to avoid. April the 2nd began with acceptable conditions. Acceptable is a specific word in high-altitude mountaineering. It does not mean good. It means within the range of what the objective demands and what the team can manage. The route was established. The men moving toward the upper camps had been on that section of the mountain before. The weather was not alarming. They left in the morning. By afternoon, the silence from the upper mountain was absolute in a way that those remaining at lower camps and base camp recognized before they were willing to say out loud what it meant. The avalanche, reconstructed afterward from the evidence and from the accounts of those who were not on the slope, released from a section of the upper northeast face above the route the team was traveling. Large slab avalanche. Wind-loaded snow on a weak layer beneath, accumulated over the preceding weeks in the specific way that Dhaulagiri's wind patterns deposit snow on that aspect. The weak layer had been invisible from the route. It had been invisible from below. The conditions that morning had not provided the surface signals, the hollow sound underfoot, the settlement cracking, the specific temperature inversions that climbers learn to read as warnings. The slab released and the slope moved. At the speeds characteristic of large, high-altitude slab avalanches, the event from release to completion takes seconds. Not minutes. Seconds. 7 men were in the path. The search party that left base camp 3 days later found what Dhaulagiri had decided to give back. Some equipment, personal items, evidence of the debris field, the disturbed snow, the areas of consolidation where the avalanche had led and deposited its load, the surface expression of what lay underneath. They did not find the men. Not all of them. Not in a form that resolved the specific questions that the families would carry forward. Where exactly? How exactly? In what final sequence of events the morning had ended? This incompleteness is something that search and rescue workers in high-altitude environments describe with a consistency that crosses languages and nationalities and decades of experience. The mountain gives back what it gives back. The rest it keeps. And the line between what is recoverable and what is not is drawn by the mountain, not by the people searching. The families of the men who died on Dhaulagiri in April 1970 received fragmentary information. They received it over days and weeks as communication from the expedition reached the outside world through the channels available in 1970. Which were, and unreliable by current standards, and which meant that the news arrived in pieces, sometimes contradictory, sometimes delayed, always incomplete. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to abstract deaths on remote mountains into statistics and expedition reports. These were people with families who waited for letters, who received instead, eventually, the particular form of news that changes everything and explains nothing. Subscribe if you haven't. This channel treats these stories as what they are, not background for adventure content, but actual human events with weight. What the search and what the subsequent analysis of the 1970 expedition produced was a body of specific knowledge about Dhaulagiri that changed how the mountain was approached afterward. The Northeast Spur, the Everett expedition's objective, was identified as carrying a specific and not fully predictable avalanche risk from the upper faces, but the evidence of April the 2nd had made concrete in a way that prior understanding of the route had not. Later expeditions that attempted the Northeast Spur, or routes in the same sector of the mountain, made decisions about line selection and timing specifically because of what the 1970 evidence showed about where the loading occurred and where the releases ran. The dead taught the living where not to stand. This is how the knowledge base of Himalayan mountaineering actually accumulates, and it is one of the most uncomfortable truths about the enterprise. The safety improvements that subsequent generations of climbers benefit from are built on the losses of previous generations. Each major incident on each major peak contributes information about snowpack behavior, about weather pattern recognition, about route selection, that makes the next attempt marginally less likely to end the same way. marginally. Because Dhaulagiri continued to kill after 1970. In different seasons, on different routes, in conditions that incorporated everything learned from every previous incident, and still produced outcomes that the accumulated knowledge could not prevent. The mountain's historical fatality rate, roughly 1 death per every 5 to 6 successful summits across its climbing history, reflects something that is not a correctable problem. It reflects the mountain's fundamental character. Dhaulagiri is objectively hazardous in ways that preparation and experience and careful decision-making can reduce, but cannot eliminate. This is not a comfortable conclusion for a culture, and the international mountaineering culture is one that tends to frame risk as manageable through sufficient skill and preparation. The narrative that bad outcomes on mountains result from mistakes is psychologically useful. It preserves the sense that the enterprise is rational, that the people who come home made better choices than the people who didn't. Sometimes that is true. On Dhaulagiri, on April 2, 1970, the evidence does not support it. The men who died made the choices that their experience and the available information supported. The mountain made a different choice. And the search party found what the mountain left behind, which was enough to confirm what had happened. Not enough to answer all the questions that the people who were not on that slope, the people at lower camps, the families at home, the mountaineering community that read the expedition reports, needed answered. Some of those questions are still open. Dhaulagiri keeps its own records. All right, one thing before you go. Drop a comment telling me which story you want next. Option 1, the specific sequence of decisions on Annapurna's south face that has produced a fatality rate higher than almost any other route in the Himalaya, and why expeditions keep choosing it. Option 2, what the climber who survived alone for 6 days on a Himalayan peak after losing his entire team actually did, hour by hour. The documented account. Option 3, the 1986 K2 season in which 13 people died in a single month. The full reconstruction of what happened and in what order. 1, 2, or 3 in the comments. And if this was worth your time,